Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to episode 2 of the Bronco Well, refilling your bucket so you can pour into others. I'm your podcast host, Molly Beldier. Just to remind you, I am an occupational therapy student completing this podcast as my capstone from Western Michigan University. I'm completing this capstone under the guidance of Dr. Michelle Suarez, who's an associate professor of occupational therapy and the Resiliency Center director at Unified Clinics located on WMU's Kalamazoo campus. Welcome back, everybody. Thanks so much for being here, and I'm excited to get into today's topics. Today's episode is titled Your Brain as a Caregiver. In episode 1, we talked a lot about an introductory overview into your nervous system. So if you haven't listened to that yet, I would recommend going back and listening because we're going to build on some of those topics today. But just as a brief refresher, let's go over some of the things that we learned in episode 1, Welcome to Your Nervous System. We talked a lot about the function of the nervous system and how it is meant to kind of be the boss system of our body and how it sends and receives messages that help us live our daily life. We talked about how the brain is kind of like the headquarters of our body, the spinal cord, the highway, and the nerves and neurons, the back roads that help messages get from point A to point B. We also talked about some specific structures of the brain, specifically within the limbic system. Now, if you recall that, that's the am I safe, am I not, limbic, limbo. That's kind of how I like to remember the function of the limbic system there. But some of those structures that we talked about include the hippocampus, which is affiliated with memories, the amygdala, which is sort of the fear center of our brain, and the hypothalamus, which is kind of our brain's autopilot. Breathing, heart rate, temperature, hormones, all in relation to keeping a balance in your system. These things all work in tandem to keep us safe. That fight or flight or freeze response that we talked about, that's triggered by the limbic system. And remember, we went even further and talked about the sympathetic nervous system, which is that survival system, and parasympathetic nervous system, which is that peace system. So if none of those things sound familiar, I'd go back and dive into some of the content from episode 1. Otherwise, we'll take it away with content for episode 2, Your Brain as a Caregiver. Our first topic in Your Brain as a Caregiver, we're going to be talking about a matter that I'm sure many of you are very familiar with, stress. We're going to break stress down into 3 different types. Now, you may have heard of some of these from what's called the ACE study, or the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, but they can also apply in adulthood too. I'll also include a link to the ACE study in case you're interested in learning a little bit more about that. But what that study is, just as an overview, is they looked at specific events from childhood that occur and can cause stress and be considered an adverse childhood experience, and how that impacted adults as they grew and developed, and the impact that it had on the brain. Like I said, I'll include a link to that in the show notes, but we'll continue on. We're breaking down stress into 3 different types. The first type we'll talk about is called positive stress, or eustress. You may be thinking there's no such thing as good stress, but there actually is. You might just not consider it stress. But eustress is actually really good for your brain and for your body. It can produce feelings of motivation, desire to take action, and wanting to achieve a goal. Those are all really great examples of what eustress does. Here's some research for you. According to an article titled Physiology, Stress Reaction by Brianna Chu and other authors, eustress can actually replenish our energy, enhance cardiovascular health, boost endurance, and sharpen cognitive function. So you can see there's actually some great benefits to positive stress, or eustress. However, to define that, we need to narrow the terms down a little bit. Often, eustress is short-term, and there's a clear path to follow. For example, if you're trying to challenge yourself by running a 5K or a half marathon for the first time, you know that process is going to be long and difficult, but ultimately rewarding. And there's a clear path. You got to train, practice, make sure you get all your good nutrients in. It's not all-consuming or overwhelming. It's a challenge, but it's not impossible. Eustress arms you with the ability to problem solve, and it boosts your resilience during other stressful situations. A term that you might have heard that's really associated with eustress is the growth mindset. Working through and overcoming challenges with the outlook that you can grow, learn, and incorporate your new experiences into knowledge and use that to overcome other challenges later in life. You're taking some stress, but it's positive and it's good for your system and it's good for your mind. As a caregiver, an example of what eustress might look like is planning an outing for your family that's maybe unusual from what your day-to-day activities look like. Perhaps it's planning an outing to the museum for the first time, and you're having to reach out to the museum, making sure they have all the proper accommodations. You're making sure that you have all the pieces of the puzzle that you need, such as maybe headphones or extra hands on deck, something of that sort, where it's a process to get there, but ultimately it's going to be a very rewarding experience, and there's a clear path to follow, and it's short term. That is an example of what eustress could look like as a caregiver. We'll pivot to another kind of stress, tolerable stress. Tolerable stress is severe and longer lasting bouts of stress, but they're mitigated by supportive relationships and time constraint activation. That's a definition from Harvard University. An example of this might be a natural disaster damaging your house, or losing a loved one, or losing a job. You might find those circumstances really difficult to overcome and very isolating on your own. However, with a support group or with resources in place, you're able to overcome those instances and move forward. The thing about tolerable stress is it's dependent per person which specific events can be qualified as tolerable or as toxic. The key differences are that there are external supports in place for you to not be consumed by this stress. So as a caregiver, you may feel that your morning routine is something that is just barely tolerable. You may have multiple children. There may be a lot of resistance in getting oneself ready for school or for work or whatever it is you're trying to help corral your child to do. But because of external supports in place, maybe you've got a really great partner that you can lean on, or other supports from the school, or things like that, you're able to keep moving forward and moving through it. It's not something that's overwhelming and all-consuming. Lastly, we'll talk about toxic stress. So toxic stress, as you can surely tell by the name, is the kind of stress that is the most negative and can wreak the most physiological havoc on your body. Unfortunately, too, as caregivers of children with really demanding needs, this might be the kind of stress that you encounter more often than the other two types of stress. The definition for toxic stress is it's frequent and or very intense, long-lasting events that can physiologically impact your brain and or the stress response systems. Remember some of those stress response symptoms we talked about from episode 1, we'll dive a little bit more into. Often, toxic stress stems from situations that are completely out of our control. Experiencing maltreatment, discrimination, racism, extreme poverty, or violence are examples that are used within the ACE study. But your day-to-day life as a caregiver may look a little different. You could very well be experiencing any of those that I just mentioned, and I certainly hope that's not the case, but unfortunately, we live in a really tough world. As a caregiver, toxic stress might just look like fighting constant battles day in, day out with no end in sight, and they can be very all-consuming and overwhelming. Those are the two terms, if you haven't quite picked up on that yet, that really help us to differentiate toxic stress from the other kinds of stress. It's all-consuming and it's overwhelming. Additionally, toxic stress also includes prolonged activation of that stress response with little to no resolution, and it begins to impact the body on a physiological level, including cardiovascular conditions such as high blood pressure, which can lead to other more severe cardiovascular problems later down the road, chronic fatigue, obesity, diabetes, depression, anxiety. Toxic stress really impacts your health on a physiological level and not just on a mental or emotional level. It can be really difficult to overcome, especially when you don't have supports in place. That might be you. You might be feeling as though your life is just swamped and overwhelmed with toxic stress. And if that's the case, then I just want you to know, first and foremost, that I am so sorry, but also this podcast is here for you as an external resource. You are not alone in this. Use what you need from this podcast, and we'll take it one step together at a time. I'm going to build some time into this episode for you to reflect on this new content. Think over some of these prompts. What kind of stress am I experiencing most frequently? What do my supporters, external, internal, look like, if there are any in place? Are there things that I can do right now to kind of change my outlook on these stressors? Take some time, think about it. When we come back, we'll go from there. Welcome back. Now we're going to dive into some conditions that result from stress or stressful circumstances. I'm not providing these definitions to necessarily scare you about you or your child, but to provide some extra context and perhaps give you a little bit more of a further insight into some of the changes that happen in your brain as a caregiver as a result of experiencing some of this toxic stress long term. Of course, please consider getting a professional's opinion and diagnosis in this matter before seeking out additional treatment. All right, first thing we'll talk about is post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have heard of this specific disorder, but I'll provide a definition of what PTSD is from the Mayo Clinic. PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, is a mental health condition that's caused by an extremely stressful or terrifying event, either being a part of it or witnessing it. This could either mean you or your child. It doesn't necessarily discriminate. Some changes in the brain that occur are the amygdala, that's that fear center of our brain, becomes overactive and it taps into that sympathetic nervous system response. Remember from episode 1, that sympathetic response is that primitive part of our brain, that survival response. Our prefrontal cortex, the core of who we are, again from episode 1, can't hit the brakes and regain control of your brain because the fear system response is so strong. Also of note, some studies show that your memory may be impacted as a result of PTSD. So that means the hippocampus might be impacted. Your brain wants to protect you. So the coding of memories might be a little bit out of whack when attempting to remember something scary or harmful. It can result in misremembering events or even just completely having those parts of your memory blacked out. That's PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. Something that you may be more prone to experience, or something that is more common among caregivers, is called secondary traumatic stress disorder. Per the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, secondary traumatic stress is the emotional duress that results when an individual hears about the first-hand trauma experiences of another. As a caregiver, this might be more common for you to experience than PTSD. Perhaps you are a foster or adoptive caregiver and you know that your child has endured great trauma while in the system. And you, as a caregiver, feel very impacted by that. This can also look very similar to PTSD in a lot of ways. Hypervigilance, difficulty with emotional regulation, sleep disturbances. But something to note is that there's a lot less studies out there about what changes may be occurring in the brain. We can draw parallels, though, from what we know happens in the brain when dealing with toxic stress and PTSD when looking at secondary traumatic stress disorder, because we know a lot of those similar brain structures are impacted. Another condition that is so much more common amongst adults almost everywhere is called burnout. It's actually a real thing and not just casual colloquial language. It even has its own diagnostic code. So if that should tell you that burnout is very real, I don't know what else can. Burnout can be defined as a loss of motivation, a growing sense of emotional depletion, and cynicism. That's a definition by psychologist Herbert Freudenberger, who first coined the term burnout. Burnout isn't just defined as long hours spent on tasks that you wouldn't prefer to do, such as household cleaning or anything of that nature, but it also can be considered like this, quote, high job demands, low control, and effort-reward imbalance that are risk factors for mental and physical health problems. Does that sound familiar? Kind of sounds like a lot of the struggles of a caregiver day to day. High job demands, low control, and an effort-reward imbalance that might lead to mental and physical health problems. On a brain structure level, a heightened amygdala and weaker connectivity to the prefrontal cortex are common to see in burnout. Are you seeing a pattern across any of these stress conditions? Additionally, burnout can go on to affect attention, memory, cognitive abilities, creativity, and a lot of other cognitive components of the brain. A thing to note also is that burnout can encompass caregiver fatigue and compassion. It's a type of burnout. It's directly related to the tasks of caregiving. You might have the energy for other things, which is different from regular burnout, but when it comes to specific caregiving tasks, you might feel emotionally numb, heavy dread. Caregiver fatigue and compassion fatigue are a specific type of burnout, but are very, very prevalent in the caregiving world. As I said before, the purpose of going through these conditions isn't to scare you or to make you feel doom and gloom. All this was meant to do was provide a little bit of extra context as to what might be going on in your body and how your brain can change as a result of it. Maybe you don't feel as though you identify into falling into either of these three stress conditions and categories. And for that, I'm grateful. It is a wonderful thing to not feel completely bogged down by toxic stress. But I'm sure there are some of you out there that feel maybe like you recognize yourself in some of the definitions of these conditions. Perhaps you do feel as though you have secondary traumatic stress disorder as a result of things and events that your child has been through. Or perhaps maybe you're feeling that compassion fatigue or caregiving fatigue and have so much energy for other tasks, but when it comes to doing certain things with your child, it can be so hard to be motivated. It is so important to me that I stress this and that hopefully you as a caregiver can understand or begin to understand this. Having these types of stress responses or stress conditions does not make you a bad caregiver. All it does is make you human. There are only so many things, times, events that can be added up over and over again onto your mental or physical load as a caregiver that won't result in the dam breaking just a bit. It can be so hard to go and do and fight these battles day in and day out with what feels like no end in sight and not a whole lot of support. That does not make you a bad caregiver. In fact, it makes you a great caregiver to recognize these things in yourself and to do something about it, such as listening to this podcast. We'll dive more into strategies on how to overcome these components of stress and even how to help yourself build external supports if that's not something that's currently accessible to you right now. It's my utter hope that after listening to all of this, that you're not feeling doom and gloom, because these things, these conditions, these habits and reactions can be countered. During this podcast series, we're going to provide further context and strategies for refilling your bucket as a caregiver and as a human. Taking care of yourself is so important. I would argue even more important when you are taking care of others. You can't pour from an empty bucket. You have to refill your own bucket first before you pour into others. Understand, though, that these things will take time. Building permanent habits require time and effort like anything. I'm sure you've heard the phrase, Rome wasn't built in a day. Well, your nervous system isn't rewired all in one day either. Little by little, piece by piece, we'll work together to help build long-lasting, permanent habits to hopefully support your mental wellness and therefore support your family's mental wellness. The third thing that I really want to encapsulate during this podcast series is to show you how to begin to take care of yourself as a caregiver and what mindset shifts and little changes you can make day to day to refill your bucket. Maybe that starts with just one thing each day. Maybe that starts with just for 5 minutes in the shower, you take some really deep breaths and give yourself some positive affirmations, just like we're about to do in a few minutes. Maybe it means letting those dishes pile up in the sink just a little bit longer, so that way you can do something for yourself. Whatever the case is, you already are on the path to building a healthier future for yourself. You're listening to this podcast. You're taking the time to understand what's going on in your brain and your body as a caregiver and how that can impact your caregiving ability, but also your ability to just be and to just be human. We discussed a lot of different things today. We talked about a lot of different research regarding the types of stress, including eustress, tolerable stress, and toxic stress, and the effects that it can have physiologically as well as mentally and emotionally. We also discussed certain conditions that can result from stress and stressful circumstances, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, secondary traumatic stress disorder, and burnout, and within burnout, caregiver and compassion fatigue. We learned a lot today. We went over a lot of different things. Throughout this podcast, we talked a lot about different research. All of that will be linked for you within the show notes if you're interested in following up on any of the studies and or articles mentioned. We're going to wrap up today's episode with some positive affirmations, just like we did the last time. We're going to keep this going throughout this series because it's really important to end on a positive, reaffirming note, especially after just kind of having a bunch of information vomited at you via podcast. So we'll take some time to just do some positive affirmations. And remember, it's not just hippy-dippy baloney. Positive affirmations are actually clinically researched and proven to be mentally beneficial. Okay, let's get in the headspace to receive and reflect on some of these positive affirmations. If you're using this podcast as an opportunity to multitask while taking care of yourself and doing 1,000,001 other things, just be prepared to meditate on this perhaps in a more in-depth way later, or just take what you need from it. I am doing the best I can with the resources I have. My self-worth is not tied to perfection. Taking care of myself is necessary, not selfish. I am allowed to ask for help when I need it. Rest is a vital part of my caregiving routine. What I do matters and makes a difference. I am a source of love and comfort to my children, my family, and myself. Thank you all so much for being here. Next episode, we are going to start with caregiver care. What does the research show? We'll be diving more into research and literature as we discuss the importance of taking care of yourself, how caregiver fatigue can impact you, the importance of having some sort of support system in place, and we'll tie in components of all the other things that we've discussed to hopefully increase some carryover and generalization of the knowledge. We'll also talk about a new concept called the default mode network. We'll get into that next on episode 3, Caregiver Care. What does the research show? This third episode will be our final episode where we build the rest of our foundation and knowledge base for where we're going with this podcast. Episode 4, Caregiver Care, starting small, we'll start to really implement some mindset changes and some other sort of interventions and tips, tricks, strategies, those sorts of things in order to help you build a healthier tomorrow. Thanks for being here and have a wonderful rest of your day.